The last sliver of sun disappeared behind the craggy mountains, as Hannah Gibson watched her husband deal away the final shreds of her dignity. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall as she stood on the makeshift auction block in the dusty main street of Leadville, Colorado, with dozens of leering men bidding on her like she was no more than a prized mare. $200, called out a rotund banker, his eyes traveling the length of her body in a way that made her skin crawl. $250, countered a gap-toothed miner whose breath could likely fell a buffalo at 20 paces. The year was 1878, and Hannah had learned the hard way that a woman without means was at the mercy of men who had none. 6 months ago, she'd been a respectable shopkeeper's wife in Denver. Now, she was property all because Edwin Gibson had gambled away everything they owned and decided his 22-year-old wife was his last asset. $500. The crowd fell silent at the new bid, nearly twice the previous offer. Hannah's eyes found the source, a tall man leaning against a hitching post at the back of the gathering. Unlike the others, he wasn't gawking at her. His face was partially obscured by the brim of a well-worn Stetson, but she could see he was watching her husband with an intensity that seemed to burn through the gathering dusk. Edwin's face lit up with greed. $500. Do I hear $550? The crowd murmured, but no one raised the bid. The mysterious stranger had effectively silenced the competition. Sold, Edwin declared, hammering his fist against a barrel. Come claim your wife, mister. Hannah felt her legs trembling beneath her skirts as the stranger straightened and moved through the parting crowd. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 28 or 29, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. A small scar bisected his right eyebrow, and his jaw was set in a hard line. Name's Samuel Quincy, he said, not to Hannah but to Edwin as he counted out crisp bills. I believe this settles our business. Edwin snatched the money, hardly bothering to hide his satisfaction. She's a bit willful, but nothing a firm hand won't fix. The stranger Samuel turned his gaze to Hannah for the first time. Madam, gather whatever belongings you wish to take. We'll be leaving town within the hour. Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. From one cage to another, she thought bitterly. But what choice did she have? With trembling hands, she climbed down from the auction block, acutely aware of the sympathetic glances from the few women present and the disappointed leers of the men who'd failed to purchase her. Edwin grabbed her arm as she passed. Be grateful, Hannah. I could have sold you to old Peabody over there. He nodded toward the gap-toothed miner. At least this one looks like he can afford to feed you. Hannah wrenched her arm away. I hope you choke on that money, Edwin. She walked with her head high to the small room above the saloon where they'd been staying. There wasn't much to pack: a faded dress, a nightgown, a hairbrush with several broken teeth, and a small book of poetry that had been her mother's. Everything else of value Edwin had already pawned or gambled away. When she returned to the street, Samuel Quincy was waiting beside 2 horses, his own powerful chestnut stallion and a dappled gray mare she'd never seen before. Is this your horse? She asked, confused. It is now, he said, taking her small bundle and securing it to the mare's saddle. And it's yours as well. Before she could question him further, he helped her mount and then swung up onto his own horse. The townspeople were still watching, Edwin among them, counting his money with undisguised glee. Samuel turned his horse toward the edge of town, and Hannah followed, uncertainty churning in her stomach. They rode in silence until the lights of Leadville were nothing more than a dim glow behind them. Samuel reined in his horse beside a small creek, and Hannah did the same, watching him warily. Mr. Quincy, she began, her voice steadier than she felt. I believe I have the right to know what you intend. You're free, Mrs. Gibson, he interrupted, removing his hat and running a hand through dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. I have no claim on you, nor do I want one. Hannah stared at him, certain she had misheard. I'm... What? Free, he repeated. That spectacle back there wasn't a legitimate sale. A man can't sell his wife like a piece of furniture, no matter what your husband might think. I only played along to get you away from him." Hannah felt lightheaded, disbelief and relief washing over her in equal measure. "But the money, $500, Samuel shrugged. "A small price to pay to right a wrong." "Why would you do that for a stranger?" His expression darkened. "Let's just say I've seen what happens to women who fall into the hands of men like those back there. No one deserved to be on that auction block, Mrs. Gibson." Hannah studied his face, searching for some sign of deception, some hidden motive. But she saw only weariness and something that might have been compassion. "What am I supposed to do now? Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, the enormity of her situation crashing down on her. "That's your choice," Samuel said. "The horse is yours along with this." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. "It's not much, but it should help you start fresh wherever you decide to go." Hannah stared at the pouch, then back at the man who had just spent a small fortune to rescue her only to set her free. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Men don't just help women they don't know." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Perhaps you've known the wrong men, Mrs. Gibson." "Hannah," she corrected automatically. "I think I'd prefer not to use that name anymore." Samuel nodded. "Hannah, then. There's a town called Silverton about 3 days' ride south of here. I know a woman there who runs a boarding house. She's always looking for help, and she doesn't ask many questions about a person's past." "Are you going there?" Hannah asked before she could stop herself. He shook his head. "I have business elsewhere, but I can escort you part of the way if you'd like." These mountains can be dangerous for a woman traveling alone. Hannah weighed her options, which were admittedly few. She had nowhere to go and no one to rely on except this stranger who had, for reasons she couldn't fathom, shown her more kindness in an hour than Edwin had in their entire 3-year marriage. "I would appreciate that, Mr. Quincy." "Samuel," he corrected with that same ghost of a smile. "If we're traveling together, we might as well use our Christian names." They made camp by the creek, and Samuel shared his provisions: salt pork, hard biscuits, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. As they sat by the small fire, Hannah found herself studying her rescuer. In the flickering light, she could see that his face was lean and weathered, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more than she'd seen. His hands were calloused but clean, and he wore his gun with the easy familiarity of a man who knew how to use it but wasn't eager to do so. "You're not a cowboy," she observed. "Not dressed like one, anyway." Samuel glanced down at his plain, dark clothes. "No, madam. I was a ranger once, down in Texas. Now I work for the Pinkerton Detective Agency." Hannah's eyes widened. "You're a detective. Are you on a case now?" "I was," he said, poking at the fire with a stick. "Tracking a counterfeiter who's been passing bad bills through Colorado mining towns. I was in Leadville following his trail when I saw that situation developing." "And you just decided to spend your money, the agency's money," he corrected. "They'll understand once I explain." Hannah wasn't so sure, but she didn't argue. "Well, I'm grateful, regardless. I don't know what would have become of me otherwise." Samuel's expression hardened. "I do. That's why I couldn't just ride away." They fell silent for a time, the crackling fire and the gentle babbling of the creek filling the space between them. Finally, Hannah asked the question that had been troubling her since they left Leadville. "What if Edwin comes after me? Legally, I'm still his wife." Samuel considered this. "Men like Edwin Gibson usually take the money and run. But if it eases your mind, I can help you file for divorce once we reach a larger town. There are grounds, considering he tried to sell you." Hannah nodded, a weight lifting from her shoulders. "I would like that. I never want to see him again. Can't say I blame you." Samuel poured the last of the coffee into her cup. "You should get some sleep. We have a long ride tomorrow." Hannah wrapped herself in the blanket he offered and lay down near the fire. She watched as Samuel moved to the edge of their camp, his silhouette alert and vigilant against the starlit sky. For the first time in months, she felt safe enough to truly rest. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the scent of pine heavy in the mountain air. Hannah woke to find Samuel already up, tending to the horses and preparing a simple breakfast of more biscuits and strips of dried beef. "I hope you slept well," he said, handing her a tin cup of fresh coffee. Hannah nodded, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "Better than I have in a long time." As they rode that day, Hannah found herself sharing more of her story, how she'd met Edwin when she was 19, the son of her father's business partner in Denver. He'd been charming then, full of ambitious plans. They'd married quickly, against her mother's gentle warnings about his reputation for drinking and gambling. "The first year wasn't so bad," Hannah said as they navigated a narrow trail that hugged the mountainside. "He tried to be a good husband. But then my father died and Edwin took control of the store. It wasn't long before he started gambling away the profits." Samuel listened without interrupting, his eyes scanning the trail ahead even as he absorbed her words. "When the store failed, we moved to Leadville. Edwin said there were opportunities in mining towns. What he meant was that there were more card games and desperate men willing to bet everything they had." Hannah's voice grew bitter. "He lost our house in Denver in a poker game. After that, it was just one humiliation after another until finally, he decided I was his last asset worth anything." "What would you have done if you'd had a choice?" Samuel asked. "Before all this happened." Hannah considered the question. No one had asked her about her own dreams in so long. "I wanted to be a teacher," she admitted. "I even started training at a women's college in Denver, but Edwin thought it was a waste of time after we were married." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "Silverton's growing fast. They'll need teachers." The suggestion kindled a small flame of hope in Hannah's chest. Perhaps, with her newfound freedom, she could still build the life she'd once imagined for herself. They traveled through breathtaking country, towering forests, giving way to high meadows scattered with wildflowers, the distant peaks of the San Juan Mountains like sentinels on the horizon. At night, they camped beneath the vast canopy of stars, and Hannah found herself increasingly drawn to the quiet strength of her companion. Samuel shared little of his own past, but through careful questions, Hannah pieced together parts of his story. He'd grown up on a small ranch in West Texas, the son of a hardworking couple who'd lost everything during the Civil War. He joined the Rangers at 18, then moved to the Pinkerton agency seeking more stable work. There had been a woman once, he admitted reluctantly, but she'd married another while he was away on assignment. "I'm gone too much," he explained with a shrug that didn't quite hide the old hurt. "Not the kind of man who can offer a woman much of a home." On the third day of their journey, disaster struck. As they were crossing a fast-moving stream, Hannah's mare stepped into a hidden hole and stumbled, throwing her into the rushing water. Hannah gasped as the icy current swept her downstream, her sodden skirts weighing her down as she struggled to keep her head above water. "Samuel!" she cried, catching a glimpse of him spurring his horse along the bank, his face a mask of determination. The current slammed her against a fallen tree, and Hannah clung to it desperately, the rough bark cutting into her palms. The water was so cold it stole her breath, making her muscles seize and tremble. Samuel dismounted at a point just ahead of her and waded into the stream, bracing himself against the current as he worked his way toward her. "Hold on," he called, his voice steady despite the urgency in his eyes. "I'm coming to get you." When he reached her, his strong hands closed around her arms, and he pulled her against his chest, sheltering her from the force of the current as he guided them both back to the shore. They collapsed on the rocky bank, Hannah shivering violently against him. "You're all right," Samuel murmured, his arms tight around her. "I've got you." Hannah couldn't speak, her teeth chattering too hard as shock and cold gripped her body. Samuel quickly gathered dry wood and built a fire, then helped her out of her sodden outer garments, wrapping her in his own dry coat and the blankets from their packs. "Your things," she managed finally, thinking of her small bundle of possessions that had been tied to the mare's saddle. "The horse is fine," Samuel assured her. "Spooked but unharmed. She made it across and is grazing up the trail. Your bundle is wet but intact." Hannah nodded, relief washing over her. The book of poetry was all she had left of her mother. Losing it would have been like losing her all over again. As the fire's warmth gradually penetrated her chilled body, Hannah became acutely aware of Samuel's closeness, of the protective way his arm remained around her shoulders. She felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her recent ordeal. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's twice now you've saved me." Samuel looked down at her, something shifting in his stormy eyes. "I'm beginning to think you're the kind of woman who's worth saving, Hannah." The way he said her name sent a ripple of warmth through her that not even the mountain stream's chill could extinguish. They remained by the fire until Hannah's clothes dried enough to be wearable again. The incident had cost them valuable traveling time, and Samuel suggested they find proper shelter for the night rather than making camp again. "There's a way station about 3 miles ahead," he told her as he helped her mount the mare. "Nothing fancy, but they'll have hot food and dry beds." The way station turned out to be a sturdy log building nestled in a small clearing, with a stable for horses and a common room where travelers could get a meal. The owner, a grizzled former prospector named Harlan, welcomed them with gruff hospitality. "Ain't often we get a lady through here," he commented, eyeing Hannah's still damp clothes and Samuel's protective stance beside her. "You two married?" "No," Hannah said quickly, a blush heating her cheeks. Samuel stepped in smoothly. "The lady had an accident crossing Willow Creek. She needs a hot meal and a place to rest." Harlan shrugged. "Got one private room in the common sleeping area. Private'll cost you extra." "We'll take the private room for the lady," Samuel said firmly. "I'll bunk in the common area." Hannah started to protest that she didn't want to take their only private accommodations, but Samuel silenced her with a gentle squeeze of her arm. "You need proper rest after today," he murmured. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand holding a pitcher of water and a chipped basin. After a hearty supper of venison stew and cornbread, Hannah gratefully retreated to change into her nightgown and comb out her tangled hair. She was nearly asleep when a soft knock came at her door. Wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, she opened it to find Samuel, his expression troubled. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said quietly, "but I overheard something you should know. There are 3 men in the common room who just arrived from Leadville. They're talking about a man named Gibson who's been flashing money around, bragging about some scheme involving his wife." Hannah's blood ran cold. "Edwin, he followed us." "Not directly," Samuel said. "From what I gathered, he's been telling people his wife was kidnapped by a Pinkerton man, and he's offering a reward for information. These men are bounty hunters headed toward Silverton, thinking we might have gone that way." Hannah sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly weak. "He won't let me go, will he? Even after selling me like an animal?" Samuel leaned against the doorframe, his face grim. "Men like Edwin Gibson don't like losing what they consider theirs, even when they're the ones who cast it aside. My guess is he spent some of that money, had second thoughts, and now wants to reclaim his property without having to return the cash." "What do we do?" Hannah whispered, fear clawing at her throat. Samuel straightened. "We change our plans. Silverton's too obvious now. We'll head west instead toward a town called Durango. It's newer, growing fast. Easy for a woman with your skills to find honest work and disappear." Hannah nodded, trusting his judgment. "When do we leave?" "First light," he said. "Try to get some rest. I'll keep watch tonight." As he turned to go, Hannah impulsively caught his hand. "Samuel, thank you. Again." His fingers tightened briefly around hers, and something passed between them, a current as tangible as the one that had nearly swept her away that afternoon. "Sleep well, Hannah," he said softly. And then he was gone, closing the door quietly behind him. They left the way station before dawn, riding hard through the morning mist that clung to the mountainsides like ghostly shrouds. Samuel set a grueling pace, taking them off the main trails and through terrain that would be difficult to track. By midday, Hannah's muscles were screaming in protest, but she said nothing, understanding the necessity of putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Edwin's bounty hunters. When they finally stopped to rest the horses near a secluded spring, Hannah slid from the saddle with a barely suppressed groan. Samuel was at her side immediately, his hand under her elbow to steady her. "I'm sorry," he said, genuine regret in his voice. "I know this pace is hard on you." Hannah straightened her spine, determined not to be a burden. "I'm fine. Just unused to so much riding." Samuel's eyes softened. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Hannah. Most women I know wouldn't have endured half of what you have without breaking." His words warmed her more than they should have. "I suppose when the alternative is breaking, one finds unexpected reserves of strength." They ate a cold lunch of jerky and dried apples, washing it down with water from the spring. As they prepared to continue their journey, Samuel suddenly went still, his head tilted as if listening. "Get down," he ordered softly, drawing his revolver in one fluid motion. Hannah dropped to the ground, heart pounding as Samuel positioned himself between her and whatever threat he detected. A moment later, she heard it too, the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching. "Stay here," Samuel whispered, moving silently toward a cluster of boulders that offered a vantage point over the narrow trail they'd been following. Hannah pressed herself against the trunk of a ponderosa pine, trying to control her rapid breathing as she watched Samuel's tense form. The hoofbeats grew louder, and then a rider appeared on the trail below, a lone figure on a lathered horse that had clearly been pushed hard. With a jolt of fear that nearly stopped her heart, Hannah recognized Edwin. Samuel must have recognized him too, for he stepped out from behind the boulders, his gun trained steadily on the rider. "That's far enough, Gibson," he called, his voice carrying in the mountain air. Edwin reined in his horse sharply, his hand moving toward his own weapon. "Where's my wife, Pinkerton, the woman you tried to sell at auction?" Samuel's tone was deceptively calm. "She's no longer your concern." Edwin's face contorted with rage. "I paid good money for her." "You had no right. A woman isn't property to be bought and sold," Samuel cut him off. "The law would take a dim view of what you tried to do in Leadville." "The law?" Edwin sneered. "You think anyone cares what happens to a wife out here? She belongs to me and I want her back. Now." Hannah couldn't bear it anymore. She stepped out from her hiding place, ignoring Samuel's sharp intake of breath. "I was never yours to sell, Edwin," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I'll die before I go back with you." Edwin's bloodshot eyes fixed on her with malevolent intensity. "Always did have a willful streak," he spat. "Should have beaten it out of you years ago." Before Hannah could respond, Edwin drew his gun with unexpected speed, firing wildly in their direction. Samuel shoved Hannah to the ground as the bullet splintered the bark of the tree behind them. His own weapon barked once, and Edwin jerked in the saddle, his gun dropping from suddenly lifeless fingers. For a terrible moment, Hannah thought Samuel had killed him. But as Edwin clutched his bleeding arm, cursing violently, she realized the shot had been precisely aimed to wound rather than kill. Samuel was on him in seconds, dragging him from the saddle and disarming him completely, checking for hidden weapons with the efficiency of a man long practiced in such matters. He bound Edwin's wound with a bandana, then tied his hands securely with a length of rope from his saddlebag. "You can't do this," Edwin raged, his face pale with pain and fury. "She's my wife." Samuel ignored him, turning to Hannah with concern etching his features. "Are you hurt?" Hannah shook her head, though she felt as if her knees might give way at any moment. "What are we going to do with him?" Samuel glanced at the raving man on the ground. "There's a marshal's office in a mining camp about 10 miles west of here. I'll turn him in on charges of attempted murder. That shot wasn't an accident." "But what about what he did to me?" Hannah asked, her voice small. "Will that matter to a marshal?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "It will when the charges come from a Pinkerton agent with a spotless reputation, and when that agent produces witnesses from Leadville who saw him try to sell his wife at auction." Edwin lunged against his bonds, nearly toppling over in his rage. "You've got nothing. It's my word against yours." "And mine," Hannah said, finding her courage again. "I may be a woman, Edwin, but I can still testify to what you did, how you gambled away everything we had." How you beat me when I begged you to stop. How you finally decided I was worth more to you sold than kept. Something in her calm recitation seemed to deflate Edwin's bluster. For perhaps the first time he really looked at her and saw not the meek, frightened creature he dominated, but a woman standing straight and unafraid, her green eyes clear and determined. "You won't win," he muttered, but the conviction had drained from his voice. Samuel hoisted Edwin none too gently onto his horse, securing him to the saddle so he couldn't escape. "We'll see about that." The mining camp was a chaotic collection of tents and hastily constructed wooden buildings strewn across a valley, where a recent silver strike had drawn prospectors by the hundreds. The marshal's office was little more than a large tent with a crude wooden sign, but the man inside wore his badge with the gravity of long service to the law. Marshal Frank Hollister listened to their story with a weathered poker face, his shrewd eyes moving from Samuel to Hannah to the sullen Edwin. When Samuel produced his Pinkerton credentials, the marshal's eyebrows rose slightly. "This is a serious accusation, Agent Quincy," he said finally. "Selling a wife, attempted murder, not to mention the counterfeiting charges you mentioned. I have reason to believe Gibson may be connected to the counterfeiter I've been tracking," Samuel explained. "The bills he was flashing in Leadville match the description of the forgeries that have been circulating." Edwin's head snapped up. "That's a lie. I won that money fair and square." The marshal's eyes narrowed. "Seems to me we've got plenty to sort out here. I'll hold him for the circuit judge. He's due through these parts in about 2 weeks." As the marshal led Edwin away to the camp's makeshift jail, Hannah felt a curious mix of relief and apprehension. 2 weeks, she murmured. "What happens after that?" Samuel guided her toward a rough-hewn bench outside the marshal's tent. "The judge will hear the evidence. If he's convinced, Edwin will likely face prison time." "And me?" Hannah asked, voicing the question that had been troubling her since they'd captured Edwin. "Will I have to stay here, testify?" Samuel nodded slowly. "It would help the case. But afterward, you'll be free to go wherever you choose. The judge can grant your divorce at the same proceeding, given the circumstances." Hannah stared down at her hands, suddenly unsure. The prospect of freedom, true, legal freedom, was so close she could almost touch it. Yet the idea of facing Edwin in a makeshift courtroom, of having to recount every humiliation in front of strangers, made her stomach twist. As if reading her thoughts, Samuel covered her clasped hands with one of his own. "You don't have to decide right now. We can find you a place to stay in the camp, somewhere safe, while you consider your options." Hannah looked up at him, struck again by the steadiness in his gray eyes. "What about you? Don't you have to continue your investigation?" A slight furrow appeared between Samuel's brows. "I've wired the Denver office about Gibson. If he is connected to our counterfeiter, they'll send additional agents. I've requested permission to remain here until the judge's hearing." "Because of me," Hannah said softly, not quite a question. Samuel held her gaze. "Yes." The simple admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to acknowledge. The camp's only boarding house was full, but the wife of the assayer offered Hannah a small room in their cabin for a modest fee. Samuel found accommodations in the tent city that had sprung up around the original mining claims, close enough to keep watch but far enough to preserve Hannah's reputation. As days passed, Hannah began to carve out a place for herself in the rough-edged community. The camp had no school, but there were dozens of children whose education had been interrupted by their families' pursuit of silver. Hannah offered to teach basic reading and arithmetic in the assayer's front room, and soon had a small class of eager pupils. Samuel stopped by each morning to check on her and again each evening to escort her safely back to her lodgings. Their conversations grew longer, more personal, no longer limited to practical concerns about Edwin or the upcoming hearing. Hannah found herself looking forward to these moments, to the quiet pleasure of his company, to the way his rare smile transformed his serious face. "You're good with them," Samuel observed one afternoon as he watched her dismiss her students, each child receiving a gentle word and a warm smile as they departed. The children, I mean. Hannah tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, pleased by his approval. They're eager to learn. Most have had so little stability in their lives. Something you understand, Samuel noted. Hannah nodded, gathering the slate tablets her students had used for their lessons. I suppose so. When everything familiar is taken away, you learn to value even small constants. Samuel stepped forward to help her, his hands briefly covering hers as he took some of the slates. What constants did you have? During the worst times with Edwin, Hannah considered the question. Books, when I could get them. The memory of my parents' marriage, how it should be between a man and a woman. And prayer, though I sometimes wondered if God was listening. And now, Samuel asked, his voice low. Hannah met his gaze, something warm unfurling in her chest. Now I'm beginning to believe he was listening all along. The evening before the circuit judge was due to arrive, Samuel invited Hannah to join him for supper at the camp's only restaurant, a generous term for what was essentially a large tent with rough wooden tables, and a surprisingly skilled cook who had once worked in a San Francisco hotel. Hannah wore her best dress, the blue calico that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair, and took extra care with her appearance. When Samuel arrived to escort her, she felt a flutter of satisfaction at the appreciative warmth in his eyes. The restaurant was crowded and noisy, but they found a small table in a corner where they could talk without shouting. As they shared a remarkably good meal of venison stew and fresh baked bread, Hannah found herself studying Samuel's face, memorizing its contours. "What will you do after the hearing?" she asked finally, the question that had been weighing on her mind for days. Samuel set down his fork, his expression growing serious. "That depends. On your assignment, on you," he said simply. Hannah's breath caught. "Me." Samuel reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers in a gesture that sent warmth spiraling up her arm. "I've been thinking, Hannah, about what happens after the judge grants your divorce." "So have I," she admitted. "I received a wire from the Denver office yesterday," Samuel continued. "They want me back. The counterfeiting case is larger than they thought, with connections to operations in California." Hannah's heart sank, though she tried not to let it show on her face. "I see. When will you leave?" "I haven't responded yet," Samuel said, his eyes never leaving hers. "I wanted to speak with you first." Hope fluttered in Hannah's chest, fragile and uncertain. "About what?" Samuel's fingers curled more firmly around hers. "About the possibility of you coming with me, not just to Denver but afterward, wherever my work might take me." Hannah stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "As your wife, you mean?" A slow smile spread across Samuel's face, transforming it in that way that never failed to make her heart skip. "I had planned a more formal proposal, but yes, as my wife." "But you said once that you weren't the kind of man who could offer a woman much of a home," Hannah reminded him, even as joy began to bubble up inside her. "I've been thinking about that too," Samuel admitted. "About how home isn't always a place. Sometimes it's a person." His thumb traced gentle patterns on her palm. "These past weeks, Hannah, being with you, seeing your courage, your kindness, your strength, I've felt more at home than I have in years." Tears pricked Hannah's eyes. "Samuel, I know it's sudden," he rushed on. "I know your experience with marriage has been terrible. I wouldn't blame you if you never wanted to enter into it again, but I swear to you, I would spend every day trying to be worthy of your trust." Hannah turned her hand beneath his, threading their fingers together. "It is sudden," she acknowledged. "And yes, part of me is afraid, but a larger part." She took a deep breath. "A larger part feels like I've been waiting for you my whole life." The look of wonder that spread across Samuel's face was something Hannah knew she would treasure forever. "Is that a yes?" Hannah smiled through her tears. "Yes. Yes, I will marry you, Samuel Quincy." He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sealed their promise more firmly than any contract. The circuit judge arrived the next morning with minimal fanfare, a no-nonsense man named Judge Wilson with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness. The hearing was held in the largest tent in the camp. hastily converted into a courtroom with the addition of a table for the judge and benches for spectators. Hannah testified first, her voice growing stronger as she recounted the gradual erosion of her marriage, the gambling, the abuse, and finally the humiliation of being put up for auction in Leadville's Main Street. Samuel followed, his testimony crisp and professional, despite the personal nature of his involvement. Edwin blustered and denied, claiming Samuel had kidnapped his wife and stolen his money. But when confronted with witnesses from Leadville, who had been summoned by telegraph, including the town marshal who had seen but not stopped the auction, his story began to crumble. The final blow came when the judge examined the money found in Edwin's possession. Several bills were confirmed forgeries, matching samples the Pinkerton agency had provided. "Mr. Gibson," the judge said finally, peering over his spectacles at the increasingly desperate man, "I find sufficient evidence to hold you for trial on charges of counterfeiting, attempted murder, and the unconscionable treatment of your wife. As for the divorce petition—" He turned to Hannah, his stern face softening slightly. "Given the extraordinary circumstances, I am granting your divorce immediately, with no waiting period. You are legally free of this man, Mrs. Gibson." "Thank you, Your Honor," Hannah whispered, relief washing over her in a dizzying wave. As Edwin was led away to await transport to Denver for trial, he hurled one last venomous look at Hannah. "You'll regret this," he spat. "Both of you." Samuel stepped protectively in front of Hannah. "It's over, Gibson, you've lost." Outside the makeshift courtroom, Hannah stood in the bright mountain sunshine, feeling as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "It's done," she said wonderingly. "I'm free." Samuel smiled down at her. "Yes, you are, free to choose your own path." Hannah slipped her hand into his. "I've already chosen." They were married 2 days later by the same judge who had granted Hannah's divorce, in a simple ceremony attended by the assayer and his wife, Hannah's young pupils, and a few of the miners who had come to respect the quiet Pinkerton agent and the teacher who had brought a touch of civilization to their rough camp. Hannah wore a new dress of soft blue cotton, purchased from the camp's general store with money she had earned teaching. Samuel had found a sprig of wild columbine for her hair, its delicate purple petals a stark contrast to the rich auburn. When they exchanged their vows, Hannah's voice was clear and unwavering, her green eyes shining with a happiness she had once thought lost to her forever. They left for Denver the following morning, the first leg of what would be many journeys together as Samuel continued his work for the Pinkerton agency. But unlike Edwin's broken promises of opportunity and prosperity, Samuel's assurances proved true. In each new town, Hannah found ways to use her teaching skills, sometimes in formal schools, sometimes in improvised classrooms like the one in the mining camp. 2 years after their wedding, as they settled temporarily in a small house on the outskirts of Santa Fe, Hannah discovered she was expecting their first child. The joy on Samuel's face when she told him was a sight she knew she would carry in her heart always. "A family of our own," he said in wonder, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Something I never thought I'd have." "Nor I," Hannah admitted. "After Edwin, I was afraid to even dream of this kind of happiness." Their son was born in the spring of 1881, a healthy boy with his father's gray eyes and a tuft of hair that promised to be as auburn as his mother's. They named him Thomas, after Samuel's father, and he became the center of their world. Samuel continued his work with the Pinkertons, but he arranged his assignments to allow for longer periods at home, particularly after Thomas's birth. The agency valued his skills enough to accommodate this unusual arrangement, especially as his reputation for solving difficult cases only grew stronger. When Thomas was 2, the family settled more permanently in Colorado Springs, where Hannah established a small school for girls that quickly earned a reputation for excellence. Samuel's work still took him away periodically, but he always returned to the haven they had created together. As Hannah watched her husband teaching their son to ride his first pony in the meadow behind their modest but comfortable home, She reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the humiliation of that auction block in Leadville to the joy of building a life with a man who valued her mind as much as her heart, who saw her as an equal partner rather than a possession. Samuel looked up, catching her watching them, and his face broke into that smile that still made her heart race after 5 years of marriage. He said something to Thomas, and the boy turned to wave excitedly at his mother. "Mama, look at me," he called, his small hands gripping the pony's mane with fierce determination. Hannah waved back, her throat tight with emotion. "I see you, sweetheart. You're doing wonderfully." Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas sleeping peacefully inside, Samuel took Hannah's hand in his. "Happy?" he asked simply. Hannah leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and pine, and something indefinably Samuel. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. Samuel pressed a kiss to her temple. "You know, when I saw you on that auction block in Leadville, something in me just knew. Even before I understood what I was doing, I knew I had to get you away from there." "Divine intervention," Hannah suggested with a smile. "God answering those prayers I wasn't sure he heard." Samuel chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her cheek. "Maybe so. All I know is that $500 was the best investment I ever made." Hannah lifted her face to his. "I believe I've repaid that investment with considerable interest, Mr. Quincy." "That you have, Mrs. Quincy," he murmured, his lips finding hers in a kiss that still held all the promise of their first. "That you have." In the years that followed, Hannah and Samuel would face many challenges: the loss of Samuel's mother, a difficult second pregnancy that blessed them with a daughter they named Sarah, an injury that nearly ended Samuel's career with the Pinkerton Agency. But through it all, their bond only strengthened, forged in the fire of that first extraordinary meeting and tempered by the life they built together. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, and they sat together companionably reading or talking, Hannah would remember the desperate woman she had been on that auction block in Leadville. How close she had come to a fate she couldn't bear to contemplate. And how one man's unexpected act of compassion had changed not only her life but his as well. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel would ask, catching her distant expression, and Hannah would smile, reaching for his hand. "About how sometimes freedom comes in the most unexpected ways." He would nod, understanding without needing further explanation. "And how the things that seem like endings can actually be beginnings." "Exactly," Hannah would agree, nestling closer to the man who had not only set her free but had shown her what true partnership in marriage could be. Exactly that. By the time Thomas was 10 and Sarah 7, Hannah's school had grown into a respected academy with several teachers under her direction. Samuel had accepted a position as the head of the Pinkerton office in Denver, which allowed him to be home most nights while still utilizing his investigative skills. Their life together had settled into a rhythm of purposeful work and domestic joy, the kind of happiness neither had dared to imagine during their first meeting. Sometimes, Hannah marveled at how far they had come from that desperate day in Leadville, she from a woman treated as property to the respected headmistress of her own school. Samuel from a solitary agent to a man surrounded by family. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Samuel surprised Hannah with a small gold locket. Inside was not a portrait as she had expected, but a tiny scrap of paper. "What is this?" she asked, squinting at the faded writing. "The receipt," Samuel said quietly, "from the auction in Leadville. I kept it all these years." Hannah's eyes widened. "But why?" Samuel's fingers closed gently around hers, both their hands cradling the locket. "To remind myself every day of what might have been lost, of how close I came to riding past that auction without stopping." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes. "Oh, Samuel, I don't want to forget," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Not what you endured, not how brave you were, not how completely you've transformed my life since that day." Hannah leaned forward to kiss him, pouring 10 years of gratitude and love into the gesture. When they parted, she whispered against his lips, "No more auctions, no more receipts, only this life we've built together." Samuel nodded, his forehead resting against hers. "Only this life," he agreed. "The one I wouldn't trade for all the gold in Colorado." And as they stood together on the porch of the home they had created through love and perseverance, the evening star appeared above the mountains, a bright pinpoint of light in the gathering dusk, as constant and true as the bond between them.